England, 1307. The air at Westminster Abbey was thick with incense and irony. On the day of his coronation, Edward of Carnarvon, newly crowned King Edward II, stood beneath the arches of history as if he'd rather be anywhere else. He was tall, handsome, with a slight lisp and gentle eyes. The crowd murmured, not because he looked weak, but because he didn't look like a king, not like his father. That father was Edward I, nicknamed Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots, a monarch as cooled and sharp as his sword. He had spent his life at war, conquering Wales, fighting France, terrorizing Scotland, and building castles like clenched fists on the land. He had no patience for poetry, tenderness, or sons who wept. His son had all three. Edward II was 23 years old when the crown touched his brow. Behind him, the ghost of his father loomed like a shadow, and beside him stood the real problem. Piers Gaveston, his favorite. Gaveston was not a king. He wasn't even a nobleman of proper blood. He was a Gascon knight, dark-haired, witty, arrogant, with the swagger of a troubadour and the ambition of a general. He had met Edward years earlier, when they were both young men in the royal household, and Edward had fallen for him instantly. Whether it was friendship, love, obsession, or all three, no one could say for certain. But what the court did know was this: Edward could not live without him. And so, on his very first act as king, Edward recalled Gaveston from exile, an exile his father had ordered, and made him Earl of Cornwall, a title once reserved for royal blood. The barons were furious, but Edward didn't care. He lavished Piers with jewels, castles, land. At court, the two dressed alike. They dined together, danced together, and even shared private chambers. During royal processions, Gaveston rode at Edward's side, not his queen.
That queen, Isabella of France, was 15 years old and watching. Isabella was not the passive girl Edward expected. She was born a princess of France, daughter of Philip IV, the Iron King. Her blood ran cold and calculating. She had been raised not for love, but for power, and she had learned early that the crown was a weapon sharpened by silence. When she married Edward, she brought a sizable dowry, a fragile peace between England and France, and her father's spies. She tried at first to be the queen he might love. She played her role in public, rode beside him on hunts, even bore him children. But the truth was as plain as the sky. He belonged to Piers. At one feast, Gaveston arranged the seatings so that Isabella was placed below him in rank. She said nothing. But that night, the French ambassador sent a message back to Paris. By 1311, whispers had become swords. The English nobility, already offended by Gaveston's arrogance, were enraged by the king's obsession. It wasn't merely scandal, it was insult. Gaveston mocked the lords to their faces, calling them clumsy, slow, or poor. He made nicknames for them, and Edward laughed aloud in court. Behind the throne, resentment grew. And so, a council of barons, led by the powerful Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, and supported by Isabella's French allies, drafted a list of demands, the Ordinances of 1311, stripping Edward of much of his royal power. At the top of the list was one demand: Gaveston must be banished forever. Edward signed under pressure, but he didn't mean it. Months later, Gaveston was secretly recalled. The lovers were reunited. The court, however, exploded. Civil war nearly broke out.
This time, the barons didn't just demand exile. They took matters into their own hands. In 1312, Gaveston was captured while attempting to flee the country. He was mocked, beaten, and imprisoned. Then, without trial or ceremony, he was executed by a group of barons. His body was left in the open, unburied for weeks. When Edward learned of his death, they say he fell to his knees and wept like a boy. For days he would not speak. He refused council meetings. He ate alone. But when he rose again,
something inside him had changed. The boy king was gone. In his place stood a man hollowed by grief and hungry for revenge. For a time, Edward seemed to recover. He threw himself into rule. He remarried Isabella officially in a second ceremony. She bore him a son, Edward of Windsor, the future Edward III. The realm, at least outwardly, returned to order, but the old wounds festered. In place of Gaveston, Edward found new favorites, the Despencer family, especially Hugh Despencer the Younger, who would soon become even more hated than Gaveston. Despencer was cold, manipulative, and far more dangerous. He used the king's affection for personal power, grabbing lands across Wales and punishing nobles who stood in his way. Edward supported him blindly. By 1320, the Despensers controlled the royal treasury, the army, and even the court itself. Isabella had seen enough. Her affection had long since turned to frost. She had watched two lovers rise above her, Gaveston, then Despencer, and endured the shame in silence. But now Despencer was targeting her family lands, seizing estates tied to her dowry.
This wasn't just humiliation. It was war, and she would not fight it alone. In 1325, Edward sent Isabella to France on a diplomatic mission to negotiate with her brother, now King Charles IV. She went, but she did not come back. While in Paris, Isabella took her revenge. She aligned with the exiled barons, made new friends among the discontented English nobles, and, most shocking of all, took a lover. A tall, brutal, exiled knight named Roger Mortimer. Mortimer was everything Edward was not: a warrior, a rebel, a strategist. And he hated the Despensers more than Isabella did. Together, the two formed an alliance not just of passion, but of revolution. In late 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a small force. What they lacked in numbers, they made up for in public support. The people welcomed them. Nobles defected. Edward's army collapsed around him. He fled, Despencer by his side, through Wales, the same land where he had once reigned as prince. But this time, there were no loyalists waiting. They were caught. They found Edward hiding in a small monastery in South Wales, wet, shivering, and silent. Once the King of England, now he was nothing but a fugitive, with a crown no one feared. The Despensers, his last remaining allies, were not so lucky. Hugh Despencer the Elder was captured and executed immediately, hung in his armor, his body burned. But it was Hugh the Younger who suffered most. Isabella and Mortimer made a spectacle of him. In the public square at Hereford, he was stripped, mocked, tied to horses, and dragged through the streets. Then they hanged him, but cut the rope before he died. He was castrated and disemboweled. His entrails burned before his eyes. Finally, he was beheaded. The crowd cheered, and Edward, broken, alone, and silent, was dragged in chains across his own country to a dark, wet cell in Berkeley Castle. There would be no trial, no confrontation, not even a royal statement. The Queen had no intention of letting him speak. Autumn, 1327. Berkeley Castle sat quiet, its gray stone damp from endless rain. Inside, Edward was kept in a small chamber with no sunlight, no comfort. His captors fed him poorly. His clothes were thin, and more than anything else, they mocked him. They sang songs through the bars of his cell, songs about his lovers, his defeats, his weakness. They called him Edward of the Straw Bed, the king without a crown, the fool who chose men over his throne. His mental state began to collapse. He stopped eating. He murmured names: Gaveston, Hugh, Isabella, his son. He scratched prayers into the stone with his nails. And then, on a night still debated by historians, he died. The official story was simple: illness, cold, despair, neglect. But the rumors were darker. One tale, passed from monk to knight, from court to poem, claimed that a red-hot iron rod had been forced into his body, through his backside, so as to leave no visible mark.
A cruel irony. A king destroyed by the very thing he had once been mocked for. Whether truth or myth, the horror stuck. Edward II, once King of England, Lord of Ireland, ruler of a vast realm, had died not on a battlefield, but in the shadows, forgotten by those he loved. Isabella, now regent for her teenage son Edward III, ruled for 4 years beside her lover Mortimer. They governed in wealth and extravagance, dressing in gold, granting themselves titles, and rewriting history. But power, once seized by betrayal, never rests easily. By 1330, Edward III was old enough to think for himself, and what he saw enraged him. He saw his mother grow rich on the throne of a murdered king. He saw Mortimer act not as regent, but as tyrant. He saw the memory of his father reduced to ash and insult. So one night, Edward III acted. With a group of loyal knights, he stormed Nottingham Castle, captured Mortimer, and sentenced him to death. Isabella, spared only because she was queen and mother, was banished from court and lived the rest of her life in quiet confinement, watching her son rule a kingdom she had once controlled. Edward II's reign is remembered not for law or conquest, but for scandal, weakness, and betrayal. But beneath the shame lies a man out of time. A man who preferred music to war, men to violence, intimacy to conquest. He was not born for the crown, nor did he ever truly want it. He wanted love and found it in the wrong places, with people who abused his trust or died for it. He made mistakes, yes. He ignored his realm, defied the nobility, and chose emotion over duty. But he also challenged the mold of what a king was supposed to be, and the world destroyed him for it. Thank you for listening, and may your dreams be peaceful, undisturbed by the echoes of the past.